Hello, friends, and welcome back to my book review series. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and this series is often meant to recommend books that I really think are fantastic and make a contribution to scholarship. I am critical sometimes of books, and I think that, I do that all in a spirit of friendliness. But I also want to promote those books, which I think are really, really good. And this is one of them. This is Daniel B. Glover's Patterns of Deification in the Acts of the Apostles. This book is a revision of a doctoral dissertation supervised by M.C. Parsons and accepted at Baylor University. This volume provides a new point of departure for understanding the deification scenes in the book of Acts. It proposes that the ascriptions of divinity made by characters in Acts draw on various Hellenic conceptions of divinity. And in so doing, it critiques traditional scholarly trends that understand the ascriptions as manifestations of quote-unquote paganism, or the author's critique of quote-unquote idolatry. Glover does a nice job critiquing these categories and avoiding them. His point is that the ascriptions of divinity are of different kinds, and they address discrete historical, theological, and literary concerns. The main point being that the author of Acts is not uniformly hostile to deification. The first two chapters of this study attempt to define divinity in the ancient world by supplying the categories already available in antiquity. The first chapter lists and describes the distinctive divine conceptions available across the Mediterranean that enable one to identify a human as a god, and it argues that the qualities typically associated with describing divinity were power, variously manifested and widely conceived, immortality, and status. Divinity could be ascribed based on the observance of one or more of these qualities, and deification scenes would typically associate specific concepts of divinity with the divinely acclaimed human. Among the several categories available for attributing divinity to humans, the concept of daimones is at least relevant, because even though they were often thought to be humans who had become divine, they necessarily required the human to have died. What this discussion of daimones reveals is that Luke's theological ontology allowed for lesser divine beings in addition to the one God in the form of angels and daimones. Apart from them, there are also heroes, demigods, and divine men, or theoi andres. The mythology of immortals, as well as the closely related Hellenistic ruler and Roman imperial cults. Each of these systems and concepts, which were pervasive in Mediterranean antiquity, made it possible for one human to look at another and identify the other as a god. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that we find several of these concepts at play in the New Testament and early Christianity more broadly, particularly in the deification scenes in Acts. Chapter 2 addresses arguments and scholarly reconstructions that insulate Judaism against the divine discourse shared with the ancient Mediterranean. Taking the figure of Moses as a point of departure, this chapter investigates the way that Moses was deified according to the categories elucidated in chapter 1, as well as the ways that Judaism used its particular religious and theological emphases to deify Moses. These patterns of deification are by no means limited to Moses in the works of Jewish authors, especially Hellenistic Jewish authors like Philo and Josephus, but also apocalyptic writers. This chapter also addresses the way that scholars have used Jewish monotheism to differentiate and, in turn, to insulate Judaism and Christianity, along with it, from their wider Hellenistic Mediterranean environs. If Jewish writers employ classic Mediterranean patterns of deification to deify Moses, then the way we think and talk about monotheism in relation to the New Testament and Judaism more broadly must account for that evidence. This chapter also argues the methodological point that we cannot use a conception of what Jewish monotheism must have been to dictate how these texts regard the divinity or glorification of human beings. The third chapter engages an initial pattern of deification, that of the self-deifier. It argues that Luke portrays Simon of Samaria and Herod Agrippa as self-deifiers, in line with similar presentations in the ancient Mediterranean, and in doing so discredits them. Close examination of the scene containing the self-deification of Simon reveals that many terms and concepts associated with nascent Simonianism occur throughout the narrative. Analysis of these parallels suggests that Simon's self-deification occurs as an opportunity for Luke to discredit the movement by demoting its figurehead from the divine great power to a magician or charlatan. It treats Herod's self-deification next, although not formally as self-deification. It argues that Herod is depicted as manipulating the people from Tyre and Sidon into acclaiming him as their god, according to the classic cult of benefactors. As this cult is closely related to the imperial cult, readers could scarcely avoid the connection with it. Luke thus uses Herod's vicious rule as an implicit critique of those rulers, such as the Caesars, who misuse their power for their own gain. Herod does so to the extreme by making himself a god. For this reason, God strikes him down. The fourth chapter takes up the pattern of denying divinity in Acts 10 and 14. When placed in the context of denying divinity in the wider ancient Mediterranean context, these denials seem to serve a vastly different function than one exegetes typically ascribe to them. Denials of divinity served a familiar role in antiquity, namely to magnify the honor of the person acclaimed. Divine denials are common among the highly regarded emperors, well-respected philosophers, and even popular fictional characters. Denials of divinity were not always accurate descriptions of one's status vis-a-vis the divine. They were simply a common rhetorical element used to display the honor inherent in the individual in question. When we turn to Peter's denial, we observe that his acclamation and refusal of the accompanying worship come at a pivotal moment, the inclusion of Gentiles among God's people. Peter's refusal of worship from Cornelius, a man deserving of salvation, demonstrates Peter's humility and willingness to be, as a Jew, identified as equal to Cornelius, a Gentile. This refusal of divinity occurs precisely in Peter's capacity as benefactor who brings Cornelius and his family the message of salvation. Peter's Christian benefaction is thus contrasted with Herod's and illustrates how Christian benefaction, in contrast, is self-sacrificing. Peter regards the honors due a benefactor to emphasize the equality of Jew and Gentile among the people of God. Paul's denial too magnifies his honor, and it likewise does something more. When he and Barnabas are acclaimed to be the gods Hermes and Zeus, the two missionaries adamantly refuse the associated worship. Paul instead advocates a turn to the living God, who gives the Lystrans all good things, including rains and seasons. This vision of God is contrasted with the Zeus of myth, which forms the basis of the narrative of Acts 14. According to the mythical substructure, Zeus and Hermes, not receiving hospitality, punish the region with a flood. The God proclaimed by Paul, on the other hand, gives rain as a gift, not as a punishment. The denial of the divine claim, therefore, appears to feed into a larger image of religious competition between the God who raised Jesus and the cult of Zeus, attested once more later in the narrative of Acts. With respect to the character of Paul, he is shown to be a true philosopher committed to the truth of the message to the point of death. His denial, like others in the ancient world, does not indicate simply that he is not regarded as divine in any sense, however. In the final substantive chapter, a third pattern of deification, the deification of the wonder-working sage, appears. Luke does not portray Paul's survival of the snake bite on Malta simply as vindication of the alleged crimes or announcement of his innocence, but it serves as evidence of his divinity. Acts 28, 1-10 has caused problems for exegetes because the divine acclamation is left without correction or refusal. The chapter argues that the opinion of the Maltese expressed that Paul is a god may not differ greatly from Luke's own judgment, but the concept of divinity at play in the acclamation remains unspecified. Luke's audience, nonetheless, has had indications of Paul's divine status placed throughout the narrative of Acts and portrays Paul as a divine man, the wonder-working sage well known in the 2nd century. Luke's ancient audience, therefore, would be primed to draw the connection between Paul's characterization in those passages with the present one. The chapter proposes, therefore, that the acclamation in chapter 28 functions as the capstone in Luke's portrait of Paul as a divine man, which operates to legitimate the divine message proclaimed by him and the other apostles in the book of Acts. Personally, I find this study to be exceptional for its multi-layered engagement with the Greco-Roman literature and conceptualities. for its refusal to employ polemical and insider terms such as paganism, and its courage to date Acts in the 2nd century, anytime between 100 and 150, but specifically favoring 120 to 130. The chapters are also very well organized, well written, and well proofread. Glover's knowledge of the secondary literature in English and German is also solid and detailed up until about 2021. Glover's overall thesis strikes me as solid. My only disagreements focus on details. There's not much evidence that Simon, who features in the book, was a Samaritan, so I find it better to call him not Simon the Samaritan, but Simon of Samaria. It's important also that in the narrative of Acts 8, Simon's devotees acclaim him divine, not Simon himself. There is an important literary difference and a theological difference between calling oneself great and being called the great power, as we see in Acts 8, 9 to 10. Thus, Simon is actually not a self-deifier in Acts 8. Although heresiologists came to depict Simon as a self-deifier, it's important not to download this reception history back into Acts. Glover rightly shows, I think, that the author of Acts' knowledge of Simonian theology was extensive, and this again raises the question about Acts' date. Our first source for Simonian theology is either the Great Declaration, preserved in the Refutation of All Heresies, or Justin Martyr in his first apology. Justin wrote his first apology about 155, and scholars debate the date of the Declaration, with reliable suggestions spanning from about 125 to 200. If the author of Acts knew the Simonian traditions in these writings, he was most certainly writing in the 2nd century, and not necessarily the early 2nd century. There's no strong reason to prefer a date of Acts in the reign of Hadrian, between 117 and 138, over, say, the early reign of Antoninus Pius, anywhere from 138 to 155, if Acts is genuinely unattested before Justin. I did wonder whether Glover really needed to resurrect the category of the theos and heir to establish his thesis. Theos and heir is literally the divine man, which is not really a gender-neutral way of talking anyway. This is a very old category made in the 20th century and picked up in New Testament scholarship, mostly in the 1970s and 1980s, a bit in the 1990s. It seems to me, however, that the category of deified person covers all the necessary qualities of the divine man, while also making it clear that there is a real and true ascription of divinity. A deified person is a God, although a lesser one, whereas a divine man could just be an impressive wonder worker of higher status. Paul in Acts 28, for instance, is truly deified, I think, but that hardly means he's promoted to the rank of an eternal God, which, in fact, would be impossible since an eternal God would never require promotion. Furthermore, making status integral to the definition of divinity also seems suspect. Higher status is, of course, a result of deification, but deification in the ancient Mediterranean world really did have to do with a change in one's nature, not just status. And finally, if Glover had the courage and creativity to cease using paganism as a descriptor, he could probably have done the same with other problematic terms such as monotheism, myth, mythological. To my mind, it's simply a matter of experimenting with more creative and innovative categories, not making an excuse to remain in the ruts of traditional terminology due to its heuristic value or for lack of a better alternative. Now, important as it is in this series to let iron sharpen iron, these points seem admittedly minor when we reckon with Glover's larger achievement, and it's that larger achievement that I want to emphasize. Glover has successfully shown that the author of Acts was not a critic of deification as such. He was, in fact, a proponent of deification, namely his own theory of it. This author was a man of his time, not always standing over the Hellenic world, wagging his finger at so-called idolatrous acclamations. He was part and parcel of the Hellenic mindset, presupposing that all due honors, even divine ones, should be given to those who produced superhuman benefits. Paul was such a benefactor. At the end of his study, Glover suggests paths for future engagement. In my opinion, we need further study on how ancient Christian conceptions of deification fed into the cult of saints, a point that Glover mentions only in passing. In sum, I want to recommend this book and commend it to you for your further reading and analysis. I've put a link to the book into my description, so go check it out. This is worth the money. I can't say that for every academic book, but if I can help this one out, I really want to. It's worth your time and your money. Thank you so much for coming along to this review series. I hope it's been helpful. If it has, please consider supporting me on Patreon and taking some of my courses online. Thank you again and take care.